morning. It is 5 a.m. in New York City, 10 a.m. in London. I'm Matt Miller in for Vonnie Quinn, and I've got a stick mic today because apparently the lav mic isn't working. This is Bloomberg Brief. Let's get you set up for the day. We are looking at stock futures that are up as oil fluctuates and U.S. allies rush for a ceasefire deal with Iran. That's as President Trump's new, yet again delayed deadline looms for Tehran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. If you're following along, it is now 8 p.m. tomorrow night so far. And all of that ahead of a week full of economic data, including fresh reads on the Trump war inflation. For the first time, we'll see what March inflation looks like. In terms of futures right now, we're looking at a 0.33% gain on S&P futures, about 0.32% gain on NASDAQ 100 futures, and the small caps doing just about the same. Take a look at treasuries. They were trading last night around 4.30 for the 10-year. Right now, 4.35, 4.36 as we see yields come up just a little bit. The 2-year at 3.85, 3.86, and the 30-year right now at 4.91, 4.92. In terms of oil right now, as I said, we've seen some fluctuation ahead of that. Well, President Trump releasing an expletive-laden tweet yesterday, or truth post yesterday, and a lot of glory to be to God and praise Allah in those. Right now, crude is actually down, but still 109.65 for a barrel of NYMEX crude. Brent trading at 103.71. These are different contracts, so you're looking at I believe the May contract here and the June contract for Brent still. Gold right now up about 0.5% at $4,698 a troy ounce. For some of the stock movers that we're watching this morning, let's get over to Kanalia Knichevich. She is here in the studio with me. Kanalia, Natalia, what do you see?
Hi, Matt. So it's a relatively quiet morning, but still we have some movers. Let's start with Solena Therapeutics. Shares are up by almost 30%. The move came after Financial Times reported that the company Neurocrine, it's another biotech company, is in advanced talks to buy Solena Therapeutics in a deal that could value Solena at about $2.5 billion. Now let's switch to energy stocks. I'm looking at Exxon, Chevron, Occidental, and pre-market. So those shares are moving lower following, of course, losses in crude prices as investors kind of assess possibility of a ceasefire and Iraq that got an exemption from Strait of Hormuz transportation of its oil, of course. And then finally, memory stocks. Micron and SanDisk, they are moving up today after Mizuho said that investors should take advantage of that weakness. We know that those stocks fell sharply from recent highs. So they said that those concerns about memory stocks is already behind us.
All right, Natalia, thanks very much, Natalia Knichevich, there with some of your movers. Coming up throughout this hour, we're going to speak with Jeffrey Stewart of GPO Fund on the highly anticipated SpaceX IPO. We're going to look ahead to a host of economic data this week with Thierry Wizman of Macquarie Group. But first off, today is President Trump's, extended deadline for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. He set multiple deadlines before. On March 26th, he gave Iran a 10-day deadline, which would have ended at 8 p.m. Eastern tonight. That had been extended from a 5-day deadline he gave on March 23rd, which was already extended from a 48-hour deadline that he set on March 21st. On Saturday, he said Iran had 48 hours, which would have expired at 10 a.m. this morning. But yesterday, he seems to have extended his most recent deadlines until tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This all comes as Israel and the U.S. carried out a wave of attacks on Iran overnight, killing more than 25 people. Let's get to our team coverage with Bloomberg's Dan Williams in Jerusalem, who covers the Middle East, and Kasia Kleminska in Washington, who leads our D.C. breaking news team. And Dan, let me start with you. Are these deadlines getting it a little bit difficult to keep up with? And what exactly do we know is going to happen when they ultimately expire?
Good morning. Your guess is as good as mine. Sure, the deadlines are oft delayed, but there is an escalation or a change in tone and language. You noted the very salty post by the U.S. president, most recently reiterating, but in unusually graphic terms, his threat to the Iranians to effectively lay waste to the country. He's made similar statements in multiple media interviews in the interim. Many of your viewers will be aware of the term deal heat from the world of business. That is when one side of a negotiation is so keen to close the deal, they might actually be rushing into a bad deal. I wonder if this delaying of deadlines and the increasingly heated language from the White House might be suggesting a deal heat on the part of the United States. The Iranians certainly don't seem to be under any pressure. They're pushing this off. They're sticking to their demand for full reparations, they say, for the war and a full exit of US forces before they consider unshackling the Strait of Hormuz, which they've effectively taken over. So time will tell. We're now waiting for that latest deadline, which you cited. The war continues, certainly when it comes to what the Israelis are saying. They're not especially optimistic. There'll be a deal, and they see every day as potentially one in which to gain further achievements against their archenemy, Iran.
Kasia, what do we hear out of Washington, D.C.? I mean, the president's post yesterday seemed, frankly, a little bit unhinged. Are senators and Congress people worried about the president here? He's using increasingly religious language as well.
Matt, look, here in Washington, we are pretty used to all of this. We are used to President Trump setting new deadlines and issuing threats. But you're absolutely right. Over the weekend, Trump increasingly focused on this graphic language, threatening Iran with bringing hell and blowing everything. What he wants is for Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz. He's very concerned about raising oil and gasoline and jet fuel prices, and he knows he has to address it. So we will hear more from President Trump today. He will speak at 1 p.m. He will give a press conference here at the White House.
I mean, he said before that he doesn't care if they open the Strait of Hormuz, and he doesn't need anyone's help. Also that he needs everyone's help. He's used, I believe, the F word for the first time in a post, and I haven't heard previously the God is great or any kind of praise to Allah language in his tweets. Seems increasingly desperate. What are we expecting to hear from him at 1 o'clock?
I agree. It does seem increasingly desperate. Trump also previously have told Americans that it's worth to pay perhaps a little bit more at the pump to suffer this short-term pain for the long-term gain for Iran not having nuclear weapons. I do expect him to focus on this theme again today to kind of talk about what is the goal, the long-term goal of this war, which is also something he has struggled to communicate. And he is facing increased criticism. Obviously, Democrats use the weekend shows to go out and criticize what looks like lack of strategy, urging President Trump to tone down the rhetoric and seek a solution. But again, we'll see at 1 p.m. whether he will do anything like this. I think this 1 p.m. press conference will focus more on President Trump praising U.S. military. He really wants to come back to this victory rhetoric. He wants to praise the operation over the weekend, which led to rescue of U.S. airmen from inside Iran after U.S. jet crashed down there. There was a 2-day rescue operation that resulted in bringing this airman back. And Trump has already said that even as he is wounded, he will completely recover.
Dan, what do we expect in terms of military action? I mean, you're reporting from Israel, where Benjamin Netanyahu has grown used to being accused of war crimes. A lot of people are saying that if the U.S. were to attack power plants or desalination plants, that could also be considered a war crime. Does that matter? Will it happen anyway?
I think behind the scenes, the Israelis and the Americans are concerned that should this threat be carried out, it might risk alienating the very population that both Trump and the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said at the outset they would like to see take over Iran after, as they put it, the regime would be demolished or degraded sufficiently to be toppled. So aside from the legal issue, which you cited, I think there's a practical concern here in terms of the long-term, long-range ramifications of such attacks. For now, the Israelis are pursuing classic military targets, as they would call it, saying that overnight, for example, they killed the chief of intelligence for the Revolutionary Guards Corps, a significant achievement, albeit someone who had apparently not been in office that long, given the succession of senior chiefs being killed and replaced in Iran. So the Israelis, for now, in terms of their public statements, will continue focusing on senior personnel, on nuclear targets in Iran, ballistic missile targets, and other military targets. They've indicated in the past an ability to hit energy targets. However, that has been one-off attacks, and it will remain to be seen. As usual, Trump, I think, calls the shots in this war, including when it comes to changing target sets. I'm not sure the Israelis would relish entering into that fray in terms of civilian targets, but time will tell if even the Americans will do that.
Dan, thanks so much for your reporting. Bloomberg's Dan Williams there on the ground in Israel. Kasia Klimasinska in Washington, D.C. Now, both Brent and WTI, as you saw earlier, are coming down a bit right now, though at relatively high levels and after some fluctuation this morning as traders weigh reports around the war. Let's get more with Bloomberg's Anthony DePaola. Anthony, what do you see in terms of the ever-rising price of crude? What kind of knock-on effects is this having on the economies that need that oil?
Good morning, Matt. Yeah, as you mentioned, crude is higher today, fluctuating, bouncing around as traders have a lot of information to take in. We've got, as you mentioned earlier, those conflicting deadlines and timelines on in terms of potential for peace talks or all-out attacks. So that's lots of whiplash there. Plus, we've got some other data out over the weekend from an OPEC Plus meeting yesterday, where they agreed to add some barrels to the market that they can't really add because Hormuz is closed. And then we've got Saudi Arabian oil prices from state producer Saudi Aramco, where they're giving record increases on some grades of crude that they can't supply, again, because Hormuz is closed. It's their main Arab light crude that they've increased really to records. So these things are all pushing oil prices higher, and that is creating the strains that we're seeing on the economies because the crude is simply not coming out of Hormuz. The producers, the major producers in OPEC Plus, which have a lot of spare production capacity, particularly in Saudi Arabia, they're not able to bring that to the market because they don't have the export capacity. That's having the knock-on effects because refiners aren't getting the crude oil. We're not able to produce diesel for trucks, jet fuel for airplanes. And so that's really having the knock-on effects. And we're seeing that where you are in the States, where gasoline prices are increasing. So really impacting that. And it will be a bigger impact the longer that Hormuz stays shut, Matt.
Anthony, we're often told that the U.S. is insulated from the closure of the Straits of Hormuz because we are such a huge oil-producing nation. We have more oil than any other country on the planet. But I'm looking at, just regular unleaded at $4.12 now a barrel. Diesel here in the U.S. at a gallon. Diesel in the U.S. at $5.62 a gallon. Why are we seeing prices rise so much here if we're so insulated and independent?
It's a global market. So when the prices increase because there's not enough oil coming out of the Gulf, so they increase for the producers in Asia, they will go somewhere else and look to buy it. They'll buy it maybe from barrels from the Atlantic Basin. Oil that would have been coming from America. So that's that pull of those U.S. exports as well that raises the price for those crude, because now in the U.S. you've got the option of selling it to a domestic refiner who can produce gasoline for the domestic market, or they've got that optionality to sell for export. So the crude market is really impacted because it is a fully global market. So this idea that the U.S. is insulated, may be insulated on supply because there is a lot of gas, natural gas there in the U.S. There is a lot of oil, but the U.S. is exporting now as well too. So that global price really impacts the United States. Aside from the fact that a lot of those products that are exported out of Hormuz, out of the Persian Gulf, do go into things like chemicals, like plastics, like semiconductors. So a lot of those things that we buy globally and that you buy in the United States are going to be getting more expensive as those manufacturing costs rise because the one of those main components. The oil,
Yep.
the petrochemicals, the plastics, that's lacking coming out of the region here.
Anthony DiPaolo, really appreciate your reporting. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Matt Miller in New York. Investment banks leading the SpaceX IPO are said to be meeting today to prepare for the deal. That's according to IFR. SpaceX sits among the big name companies, the biggest name companies, such as OpenAI, Anthropic, and Barrick Mining, targeting an initial public offering this year. Joining us now is Jeffrey Stewart, Managing Director of GPO Fund and author of Global IPO, The Great Rewiring of Capital Markets. Jeffrey, great to have you on the program. Let me first ask you about SpaceX. I want to get kind of to all of these and to IPOs in general, considering your book and what we've seen in terms of the evolution of the IPO. This will be one of the biggest ever. What do you expect?
I expect it'll be priced well. Everyone in the world is looking at it, and there is a lot of interest in getting into IPOs globally. I think that it'll do well, but it's big, and how much bigger can it get at that size?
So I wonder why SpaceX and OpenAI need to go public, considering the fact that so many companies have stayed private for much longer. I mean, is there a tipping point at which private markets can just no longer offer the amount of capital needed to fund the kind of growth that these companies want to see?
Yes, that's exactly what's happening. We saw the same thing with steam at the turn of the 1900s, where the capital markets, the public markets, were what were needed to fund that level of investment. And we're entering an era where we're going to need that level of investment, but there's also that level of return. And it's not just the AI companies. Every industry is going to be reformatted because of AI. If you're in an industry that's relying on regulation to protect you, AI is really good at navigating that. If you're using science of materials, engineering, design, AI is really good at supporting those processes. So I think you're going to see massive, massive investment, the type of investment that only the public markets can support.
So the names I've read out are all incredibly large. I mean, SpaceX will be a $1 trillion company, OpenAI around that level, Anthropic not quite as big, but we're still talking about multiple hundreds of billions of dollars. What about smaller companies? Do they no longer need to go public?
No, just the opposite. The innovation that's about to occur, and the part that really excites me as an investor, is these companies that can now move public earlier in their life cycle and use the public market to gain credibility, prestige, and have a lot more flexibility in their capital structure. And what we're seeing, and what SpaceX is proving, will help prove, is that there's massive demand globally for these types of high growth companies. So I think you're going to see waves of smaller companies going public and then becoming decacorns and centicorns in the public market.
In terms of getting hold of these shares, I've had a lot of retail investors reach out. How can I get OpenAI before they go public? And I look to these secondary marketplaces, and there are not a lot of shares available. Many funds have snapped up these shares before retail investors can get a hold of non-public companies. How does that market look to you?
Yeah, it's a market we're very familiar with. I think what people are going to learn is that a lot of those shares in the secondary markets actually aren't shares. In some cases, they're SPVs with rights to other SPVs with fees upon fees. And in many cases, the underlying shares are actually just a right to get shares when the company goes public. And those rights are subject to a right of first refusal if the company doesn't go public. So I think there's a lot of opacity in the private markets. It's one of the reasons that I'm such a big fan of companies moving into the public market. It's good for investors. They know what they're getting, and it's good for companies because they know where their shares are.
Jeff, I grew up in the 90s and working at brokerages. I saw these big pops when IPOs came to market, and then the value dropped. Is that still what we're going to see? Is that pattern with us forever?
No, I don't think that pattern's with us forever. That's idiosyncrasy of the U.S. market, with our Rule 144, it causes a large amount of selling 180 days later, and also because of the pre-marketing rules in the U.S. But what we're seeing is an increasingly global market where there's better price discovery by involving more international investors, by involving international exchanges. And then the secondary markets means that there's not as much selling pressure 180 days out. So I wouldn't bet that 180-day drop-off that we've seen historically is here to stay.
Jeffrey Stewart of GPO Fund, really appreciate your time. Coming up, we'll get a look at what else is making your headlines and your front page news. This is Bloomberg. Taking a look at S&P futures right now, we're looking at a gain of 1/3%. The dollar right now down 0.2, and the 10-year yield at 4.36. Coming up, Thierry, Wizman, and Macquarie on how markets are assessing Trump. It is 5:30 a.m. in New York City and 10:30 a.m. in London. Good morning. I'm Matt Miller in for Vonnie Quinn. This is your Bloomberg Brief. Let's get you set up for the day. Stock futures rise and oil comes down as U.S. allies work towards a ceasefire deal with Iran. That's as President Trump's latest delayed deadline looms for Tehran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And all of that comes ahead of a week full of economic data, including the first read on Trump war inflation. In terms of what we're looking at right now, in terms of the actual numbers this morning, you'll see S&P futures up about 1/3%. We closed up just a bit on Friday as well in the cash trade. NASDAQ futures and Russell 2000 futures gaining twice what we're looking at on the big benchmark. In terms of Brent, we are coming down, but still at relatively high levels. These are the the Treasury picture right now. 385 on the 2-year, 435 on the 10, and 492 on the 30-year. Take a look at oil here. NYMEX trading down 2% almost to 109.62. Brent at 107.20. These are different contracts. Brent's the forward contract is the June contract right now, and NYMEX is the May contract. So that's why they're relatively close, and you see WTI a little bit higher. Gold up about 0.5% right now, $4,700 a troy ounce. For some of the stocks that we're watching this morning, let's get over to Natalia Knijevich. Natalia, what are you looking at?
Hi, Matt. Tyson Food shares are up by almost 1.8% in pre-market. It came after Piper Sandler analysts upgraded the stock to overweight from neutral. So they see some near-term catalysts coming from beef and chicken. They also said that this business is kind of insulated from GLP-1 trends, and this new price target implies a 16% move up from the latest closing price. Now let's move to another stock. We look at shares of Celena Therapeutics. The biotech company shares are up by almost 30% in pre-market. It came after Financial Times reported that another biotech company is trying to buy Celena Neurocrine, which would value Celena at about $2.5 billion. And then finally, Micron and SanDisk. We look at those shares that are moving higher today. Mizuho analysts are saying that they are buyers right now, and they also said that those concerns about memory stocks are already overblown and kind of behind us, Matt.
All right, Natalia, thanks very much for that look at stocks. Now, Thierry Wizman at Macquarie weighing in on the market reaction from the Iran war as it enters its 6th week. Trump's rhetorical gymnastics are seen increasingly as part of an effort to manage Iran's expectations and traders' expectations simultaneously. He joins us now, Thierry Wizman, global FX and rates strategist. So these tweets, these Truth Social posts that seem increasingly unhinged, and I don't want to editorialize, but he started using the F word, and he started saying praise be to Allah. You think that's part of a strategy?
I think it could be part of a strategy. I think there was an American senator who said that the first casualty of war is truth. Interestingly, the word truth is in that comment, and Of course, President Trump's platform is called Truth Social. I don't think there's too much of a coincidence there. He's trying to convey the truth, or at least he wants the people to believe that what he's saying is true. What he's saying may not be true, of course.
Given our experience with him over the past 10 years.
Absolutely, but more importantly, it's not because I think he's necessarily lying, but he may simply want to intentionally mislead. The idea being, of course, that if you convey to your enemy in a time of war that you're unpredictable, that you're kind of crazy, it actually may work to your advantage.
I don't think he needs to convince anybody of that.
I think, let's put it this way, I think he needs to remind them of that. And I think this is the purpose of some of these tweets. If you believe that you're facing a madman, you're much more likely to be inclined to give in to his demands. I can't rule that out as a strategy of war, effectively.
So we've heard this previously. It's the crazy Ivan theory that Scott Besson has touted. What, though, do traders fall back on in terms of the objectives of this war? I mean, he's said that he doesn't care if the Strait of Hormuz is reopened. And lately he's said that if it isn't reopened, he'll rain down hell upon Iran.
Right. So the president is trying to manage three actors in this complex. He's trying to manage Iran and what they want to do or going to do. He's trying to manage the market, and he's trying to manage the allies, or purported allies. I think whenever you read something, you have to try to ask yourself, who is he directing that comment towards? Now, clearly, when he sends out a Truth Social talking about the prospect of bombing Iran, he is addressing Iran. He's saying to them, look, if you don't do this, this, and that, I'm going to do this, this, and that, potentially. When he says, I don't care about the Strait of Hormuz, he's addressing the allies. He's basically telling them, look, I'm not going to do anything because I want you to do something instead. And then there's other instances, of course, where he's managing the market by reducing the intensity of the rhetoric, reducing the flames. So I think in every single one of these comments, you have to ask yourself first, who is he trying to address? The problem with trying to interpret what he's saying or trying to connect the dots and draw a pattern is that he is not addressing the same party in each instance, and those parties are motivated by different things. It's a very difficult task for him to try to manage all three simultaneously, I might imagine.
Markets still seem to be giving the benefit of the doubt in terms of treasuries, in terms of the strength of the dollar. I mean, part of the petrodollar deal is that we will provide security for the Gulf and keep the Strait of Hormuz open in order for oil to be priced in dollars. I mean, that's how come we are the global reserve currency. That doesn't seem set to change anytime soon.
I agree with that. I think that the president needs to reassert American preeminence with regard to to securing the important trade supply lines around the world, especially the ones that are maritime. That's been an important role of the U.S. Navy historically. It has to be reasserted for the U.S. to at least continue to maintain a modicum of perception that it is the defender of the global order, but more importantly, for the U.S. dollar to stay strong, because as you seem to have suggested, there is an implicit agreement between the U.S. and the rest of the world. We will protect you, but you buy our dollar, you finance the deficits that are necessary for us to promote a large defense industry, to finance it. That's the implicit contract. If the U.S. reneges on one part of the contract, it stands to reason that other countries may renege on their part.
When it comes to the assets affected, I mean, oil has to be the one you're watching most closely, as we all are. What do you think about, $110 barrels of oil? How much longer can we tolerate this price level? Is this price level okay? I mean, the administration seems to have suggested it's all right as long as it doesn't get to 150.
Yeah, of course, to some extent, there were cargoes that were already seaborne at the time that the war began. They may not even have reached their destination yet. So there's been some buffer with regard to what has been floating, what has been in inventory. But if the Strait of Hormuz continues to be shut, there's no reason why we couldn't see oil well above $120 per barrel and potentially up to $150. The good news, of course, is that Iran has been letting some cargoes through in recent days, and that has taken the pressure down a little bit. In addition to the news about the prospect that there are peace negotiations taking place, and we may see some sort of ceasefire agreement, the other thing to consider is that some oil is starting to come out.
What do you think about markets here? I mean, we really haven't taken much of a hit. I'm looking at futures over 6,600. We closed over 6,500 on the S&P Friday, and it's not just the war, right? We've had so many issues. I mean, AI may eat everybody's lunch, and still we're only down 4%.
Yeah, well, when you're talking about the broader market, of course, there were some good news stories out there, and I would put AI as a story that's actually good for the market, if not necessarily good for other sectors of the economy or other agents in the economy. With regard to why the market hasn't fallen as much as one might presume it would have, in view of this war, I think you have to credit to some extent President Trump in his ability, again, to address all three parties simultaneously. That message may not be working with Iran. It may not be working with the allies. But optically, it seems to be working to some extent with the market when he seems to suggest that this war is not going to be a long war. The markets have believed that effectively until now.
All right, Terry, great having you on.
My pleasure.
Stay with us. Thanks so much for joining us. Terry Wizman there of Macquarie Group. Let's get to your other top stories trending on the terminal this morning. Hedge funds have turned bullish on wheat for the first time in 4 years. Long positions on Chicago wheat outnumbered short contracts by over 8,500 in the last week of March. Hedge funds are betting on higher prices due to dry weather and fertilizer shortages. The Trump administration has asked satellite imagery providers to voluntarily withhold images of designated areas due to Trump's war in the Middle East. This has prompted San Francisco-based commercial satellite provider Planet Labs to restrict access to data from the region. The development underscores the growing strategic role of commercial satellite operators in modern conflicts. And President Trump has endorsed former Fox News host Steve Hilton to be the next governor of California. Trump's endorsement deals a blow to the other leading GOP contender in the race. Hilton has made inroads with prominent donors such as Rupert Murdoch and golfer Phil Mickelson. Coming up, President Trump set to speak this afternoon as allies press for a ceasefire deal. More on that next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Matt Miller in New York. Over the weekend, President Trump extending his deadline yet again for opening up the Strait of Hormuz, with two 48-hour deadlines, one on Saturday, another one seemingly on Sunday. This comes as Israel and the U.S. carried out a wave of attacks on Iran overnight, killing more than 25 people. So to be clear, we had a deadline of what would have been 10:05 a.m. this morning. That superseded a deadline that was supposed to be for 8 p.m. tonight, and now it seems like he's set a deadline for 8 p.m. tomorrow night. Joining us now is Bloomberg's D.C. breaking news team leader, Kasia Klimasinska. Kasia, it's very difficult to keep these things straight, but as our last guest surmised, perhaps that is the point. President Trump trying to convince the Iranians that he's slightly unstable. How is Washington reacting to this? It's very difficult.
Hello, I think you are exactly right. We have those changing deadlines, but the good news here is that, of course, it gives both sides more time to negotiate, and I think that it's also a bit of a relief for the markets, as we saw the U.S. equity futures are still up a little bit. That's always, another 24 or so hours without another major escalation. Because when we go back and look at those threats, President Trump said again over the weekend that if Iran doesn't open the Strait of Hormuz, the U.S. will attack power plants and bridges, so that would be a major escalation, assuming that, of course, Iran would retaliate. So, the more we don't see it yet, the better news that is, even as it's unclear what exactly are the negotiations between whom and whether they will yield any results. But over the weekend, of course, there were also several voices coming, especially from Democrats here in Washington, criticizing President Trump for what looks like a lack of strategy and urging him to de-escalation, to tone down the rhetoric. Obviously, Trump did the exact opposite, and he will speak again today. He will talk at 1 p.m. I expect him to come back to his victory rhetoric, praising U.S. military, and again coming back to this narrative of U.S. dominance in the region. He also, President Trump, told ABC over the weekend that this war will take days, but not weeks. He said that Iran will not be able to withstand the hell that the U.S. will bring if the Strait of Hormuz is not open.
Well, good reason for a victory lap after we rescued the crew of a downed fighter jet over Iran. What do we know about that, and will we see the crew members today?
Indeed, this was a very interesting operation that President Trump has described in his Truth Social post over the weekend. That's about a U.S. fighter jet that was downed by Iran, but eventually both crew members of this jet were rescued. First, the pilot relatively quickly, and then the second officer. But the U.S. has, devoted hundreds of people, and it had CIA helping. It had this special operation where it was trying to distract the Iranians and try to prevent them from getting to this American airman first. And eventually the U.S. managed to recover him. And as Trump said, he is injured, but he is expected to completely recover.
All right. Kasia, thanks so much for joining us. Bloomberg's Kasia Klimasinska out of Washington, D.C. Let's turn now to domestic affairs. The Trump administration has released its budget request for 2027. Let's get a closer look with Nathan Dean, senior government analyst of Bloomberg Intelligence. And, of course, the headline that we've all read already, Nathan, is the president wants $1.5 trillion now because of his war in Iran. How likely is he to get that?
So not very likely. I mean, obviously, we saw this $1.5 trillion ask come out, the largest ask in U.S. history for the national security portion of the government. But there's two ways that President Trump wants to implement this. The first is the appropriations process, and that involves Democrats. So that's not going to happen. Yes, you are going to see Democrats approve a lot of this, but ultimately, come September 30th, when either you have the appropriations process resolved or continuing a resolution, some portion will be funded. But the more important question right now is what happens to this $200 billion request from the Pentagon that President Trump wants to pass via reconciliation. He wants to bypass Democrats. Now, the bulk of that is for anti-missile or counter-drone technology. So think Lockheed Martin, RTX, Northrop Grumman. But the question that we have, and this is what we've been telling our clients, is that if it stays at $200 billion, the odds of that passing by July 1st are somewhat decent. If Republicans seek to increase that package, and next thing you know, you have a $1 trillion reconciliation package, then the odds aren't so good, and that stretches out longer. So we'll have to see what Republican lawmakers want to do when they get back from their recess, because the price tag will ultimately dictate, the outcome of success.
The idea was that we would have lower budget deficits and by the end of his term, or maybe by the end of the decade, a lower national debt. How does the president look like he's faring so far with those goals?
So the president isn't even actually looking at it. I mean, as part of this budget request, they didn't even include impacts onto the deficit. And with the One Big Beautiful Bill last year passing, we would argue be inflationary and also increasing the deficit. It's not a message that you hear from the president or the White House all that much. Obviously, Democrats are going to be really trying to push on this. They're pushing on affordability ahead of the U.S. midterms. But President Trump has really taken this past few months to look outward geopolitically, and he hasn't really looked domestically yet, especially in advance of these midterms. Now, I would expect that to change, but you're not going to hear a lot of messaging about, the deficit or anything like that, because one of the avenues that the White House did to try and change that message, DOGE, was not very popular with the American populace. So you're not probably going to hear about DOGE all that much for the rest of this year.
What about, childcare? I was at the Economic Club of New York speech where President Trump said there would easily be enough money to pay for child care. He also repeatedly promised to voters that he would support or not hurt Medicare and Medicaid. However, last Thursday, I saw a clip where he said we can't afford child care, Medicare, and Medicaid because of the war. Has he changed his tune on those things?
Yeah, so I actually don't think the president has many tools in the toolbox that he can do to change that at this point. Just at the end of the 2025, we saw this debate over Obamacare premiums, and we saw over 20 million Americans lose those subsidized premiums as a result of inaction by Congress. And President Trump's view at the moment is, look, there's really nothing else I can do to change that. The situation is what it is. So when President Trump is focused on Iran at the moment, he's focused on national security, it means he's not focused on other things at the moment. And when it comes to funding in particular, whether it's another act of Congress or whether it's trying to reallocate funds, his hands are somewhat tied. And so I think President Trump just right now is just focused specifically on what is in front of him, and other things that aren't in front of him, I think he just is going to say, we're going to leave that for another day.
All right, Nathan, great to get your take, and always informative to read your newsletter. So look forward to that every week. Nathan Dean of Bloomberg Intelligence. You can check out his work on the Bloomberg terminal and some of it on Bloomberg.com. Coming up, we're going to get you set up for your trading week. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Matt Miller in New York. Let's get a look at what's ahead this week. ISM Services PMI for March comes out at 10 a.m. Eastern time, so we'll get a look at that data. Then we get PCE, personal income, spending, and jobless claims on Thursday. And we're going to wrap up the week with CPI and the University of Michigan consumer sentiment on Friday. So we're going to get an important first look at the effects of the Trump war on inflation. In terms of what we're watching in the live market today, you can see that Occidental is down 2% in the pre-market. This is the price of oil drops. Strategy, which was MicroStrategy, so it's a Bitcoin play, up 4% with the underlying asset. And you can see that Soleno Therapeutics right now is up a huge jump there, 30%. Soleno shares rallying on report of Neurocrine nearing a deal. So this is one that I'm sure we'll be talking about a lot on Open Interest as well. Tune in for that program at 9 a.m. every weekday with me and Danny Berger. Let's take a macro look here. S&P futures right now up about 0.3% on optimism that we could get a negotiated ceasefire, a 45-day ceasefire. This, according to reporting from Axios. We'll see if that comes true. NASDAQ futures up more than 0.5%, as are Russell 2000 futures. Oil, importantly, is down, but from very high levels. So NYMEX crude WTI is off 0.5%, but still at $111 a barrel. This is for, I believe, the contract ending, May 26th. The June 26th contract for Brent is a little bit lower at 103 because it's further out. That's why WTI is higher than Brent, but they're both down just a little bit right now, and gold rising a bit as well to $46.94 a troy ounce. That's it for Bloomberg Brief. Bloomberg Surveillance is up next. This is Bloomberg Television.